Mob historians record the Big Circle Gang, also known as the Big Circle Boys, as a Chinese triad network that takes shape in the late 20th century and then spreads outward into multiple countries. The record places their active period from the 1970s to the present, with territory tied to Hong Kong, Guangzhou, Malaysia, the United States, Canada, and Australia. Their Chinese names appear in the file as Daquan Bang for Big Circle Gang, and Daquan for Big Circle Boys, with Mandarin and Cantonese romanizations listed alongside them. Their activity set is described broadly as racketeering and violence, with trafficking, extortion, intimidation, money laundering, and contract killings included in the same summary. In Canada, one account from 2009 describes the Big Circle Boys as among the largest and most sophisticated criminal conspiracies operating there. The origin story in the record starts inside China's penal camps in the late 1960s, not in a street district or a harbor. These groups are described as forming from former Red Guards, the paramilitary youth force created during the Cultural Revolution under Mao Zedong. When Mao turns against the Red Guards and orders a crackdown using the People's Liberation Army, many former members are arrested and sent to prison camps. The record ties the early Big Circle identity to squalid camp conditions around Guangzhou and to prisoner competition for food and survival. Prison camp locations were marked on maps with red circles, and the gang adopts that red circle as a symbol and a shared identifier. From the start, the file frames the group as forged in detention, shaped by discipline, and built around a hard internal loyalty. Between 1969 and 1975, the record says members are released or escape, and many move as refugees into British Hong Kong. The file emphasizes a shared background, former Red Guard experiences, and prison camp time, and it links that shared history to clannish behavior and coordinated action. In Hong Kong, police give them a nickname, Dai Huan Jai, translated there as Big Circle Boys, and the name stays attached to them. The record describes well-planned raids and a readiness to use firearms, and it ties their early targeting to jewelry stores, payroll offices, and casinos. This is the moment their identity becomes public-facing, a label from law enforcement, a symbol from their own history, and a pattern of robberies that builds a reputation. From Hong Kong, the record places the next major spread in the 1980s, with operations said to take root in the Netherlands and Great Britain. The same expansion chapter places them in Canada, specifically the lower mainland of British Columbia and the Greater Toronto area. The file highlights a distinction that mattered in Canadian policing. This was presented as the first triad originating in the People's Republic of China to operate in Canada, while earlier triad presence was commonly tied to Hong Kong or Taiwan. The record also notes 2 lanes of entry: illegal immigration tied to criminal records in Hong Kong, and legal entry using refugee claims. By the late 1980s, the record describes Big Circle Boys in Vancouver and Toronto Chinatown districts, tied to armed robberies, home invasions, and kidnappings aimed at wealthy Chinese Canadians for ransom. The methods section describes the Big Circle Boys using elements associated with traditional triad ranks, rituals, and iconography, even while their real structure is presented as less formal than older triads. The file gives a short background on triads as organizations that began as patriotic societies opposing the Qing dynasty after 1644, with crime becoming the funding engine over time. A Canadian criminologist cited in the record argues the Big Circle Boys do not show the full initiation structure and ritual system, commonly linked to traditional triads. The record frames them as closer to a brand than a single unified gang, described as multiple crews of roughly 10 to 30 people scattered across countries and linked by the shared red circle symbol. Their strength is described as networking across borders, with members and partners moving through China, North America, the United Kingdom, and other locations. By the early 1990s, the record says their activity shifts from robbery-heavy work into higher profit lanes. The list includes prostitution-related rackets, human trafficking, drug smuggling, loan sharking, credit card fraud, and counterfeiting, including currency, computer software, and films. A Canadian-focused claim in the file describes them as significant players in digital piracy and in counterfeiting, with real estate fraud also named in the same grouping. A Vancouver Police Service sergeant is quoted describing them as sophisticated, businesslike, and attentive to mistakes. One anecdote in the record describes an arrest where a Big Circle member carried the transcript of his own credit card fraud trial, studying it to understand the prosecution approach. The portrait that comes through is procedural, the habit of learning from paperwork and court outcomes, not only from street outcomes. The record then ties them to heroin movement out of the Golden Triangle region of Southeast Asia, naming Burma, Thailand, and Laos as the source area in that telling. It describes a wholesale model. Heroin moved into Canada, the United States, and Europe, then sold at markup to Chinese or Vietnamese street gangs that handle the riskiest street-level portion. A key figure named in the file is Con Yu Luang, also called Johnny Con, described as based in New York City and characterized by the Drug Enforcement Administration as a top-tier heroin dealer. The file describes a 1985 case at Seattle's International Airport where 2 couriers from Hong Kong are arrested with 97 kilograms of heroin. It adds that one courier fled to Thailand and was later murdered, while another refused cooperation and received a lengthy sentence, and it identifies both couriers as working for Con. A later enforcement marker in the record is Con's arrest in 1988, with charges described as smuggling 453 kilograms of heroin into the United States between 1984 and 1987. This portion of the file reads as a transition from crew-level robbery to pipeline-level narcotics, where the profit depends on logistics, partners, and quiet movement, rather than fast hits. The same general model repeats across the story: a central organizer and a layer of couriers, with the organization insulated by distance and by compartmentalization. The record keeps the focus on quantities, routes, and the way enforcement cases reveal the shape of the network. Names show up briefly, then disappear, while the system continues with new couriers and new cover identities. In Canada, the record includes a December 1990 case where Vancouver police break up a human smuggling ring led by Big Circle members. The file says false passports were manufactured in Canada and mailed to China complete with fraudulent entry stamps. The fee listed is $20,000 per forged passport, presented as the price of entry for people trying to reach Canada through the ring. The record claims most of the illegal immigrants in that pipeline were people with criminal records in China, and it contrasts Chinese penalties, including the death penalty for certain offenses, with Canadian sentencing practices. This section stays focused on mechanics, document forgery, mailing routes, pricing, and the way migration and criminal networks overlap in enforcement files. Toronto appears again in the record through Tse Chi Lop, described there as arriving in Canada in 1988 and leading Big Circle Boys activity in the early 1990s. The file describes an alliance involving Montreal's Vito Rizzuto, Colombia's Cali Cartel, and Italy's 'Ndrangheta, presented as a multi-group arrangement for moving heroin and cocaine across markets. In that telling, heroin from Southeast Asia is destined for the United States and Europe, while cocaine from Colombia is moved into Canada and then onward toward Asia. This is the global version of the Big Circle story, a web of partnerships where the group functions as a connector and facilitator rather than a single closed crew. The record also places their current strength back in southern China, describing activity around Guangdong and Guangzhou and tying it to unregulated factories and underground banking. One line in the file is blunt about the group's later reputation in North America. It describes them spreading rapidly across Canadian cities in the 1990s, with confidential informants portraying them as trusted bonding agents among fluid Asian drug trafficking networks. It claims they controlled much of the heroin trade in central China, and later held a large share of heroin and fentanyl distribution in the United States and Canada. The record frames the Big Circle Boys as transnational organized crime rather than a single city gang, an identity built on movement, handoffs, and networks. are later marketized to January 22, 2021, when Dutch police arrest Se Chi Lop during Operation Kungur, with the file describing him as an alleged leader connected to the largest syndicate known as Sam Gore, or the Company. The same entry cites a United Nations Drug Office estimate placing the larger syndicate's turnover at $8 to $18 billion in 2018. The record also preserves a list of relationships, presented as allies and rivals, which matters for how law enforcement and researchers map the organization's surroundings. Allies listed include Sam Gore, the Company, the American Mafia, Red Hua, Fujian gangs, Wo Xing Wo, Menace of Destruction, Asian Boys MS-13, and Netas. Rivals listed include 14K, Bloods, Piru Street Boys, Crips, East Side Longos, 211 Crew, Soldiers of Aryan Culture, Aryan Circle, Aryan Brotherhood, Nazi Lowriders, Aryan Nations, and the Linwood Vikings. Those lists read less like a single consistent feud chart and more like a snapshot of where conflict and cooperation were reported in different places over time. The record also includes a C, also pointed to the Canadian property bubble, and a single book citation for Stephen Schneider's Iced, The Story of Organized Crime in Canada, 2009, reflecting how much of this portrayal is anchored in Canada-facing research and court reporting. Mob historians record Se Chi Lop, Zi Jile, as a Guangzhou-born figure who later held Canadian citizenship and became known under a long list of street and operational names: Se Chi Lap, Brother Number 3, Sam Gore, T1, Alap, Dennis, and Zi the Zint. He was born on October 25, 1963, in Guangzhou, Guangdong, and in later reporting he is framed as the hidden boss behind Sam Gore, a transnational syndicate also called the Company. In the record he is also tied to the Big Circle Gang, with membership and relationships that carried from southern China into Hong Kong, then into Canada. Public awareness of his scale lands late, with major coverage breaking in 2019, after years where investigators in multiple countries were already tightening the picture. Media often used the El Chapo of Asia label for shorthand, while law enforcement focused on the mechanics, routes, partners, seizures, and money movement. Mob historians place his start in Guangzhou, where he is described as connecting with organized crime while still young, and later joining the Big Circle Gang as a youth. He moves through Hong Kong for a period, then immigrates to Canada in 1988 with his fiancée, settling in Toronto, and the file says they married in 1989. Early Toronto life includes ordinary employment, with work noted at Fujifilm and Kodak, a surface track that sat alongside his underworld ties. In a statement recorded after his 1998 arrest, he claims his parents and in-laws moved to Canada to be under his care due to sickness, and he says he had 2 children, with one child born with breathing problems. The same record also places him living in mainland China for a stretch, while overseeing heroin operations, and later being based in Hong Kong from 2011 until his arrest in 2021. Investigators record him staying close to the Big Circle Gang in Toronto during the late 80s, right as the group tried to establish itself in Canada. He is described as a mid-level member at that stage, yet still positioned to negotiate deals across groups that rarely trusted one another. The file says he helped shape a partnership with the Toronto branch of Montreal's Rizzuto crime family, setting up a pipeline for high-purity, low-cost heroin from the Golden Triangle into Canada. Distribution is described as running through mafia-connected networks in the United States and Italy, a lane presented as unusual for that era's routine dealings. Wiretaps by Canadian authorities are described as identifying him as the key contact point in that arrangement, and the record credits the venture with helping big, circle-linked crews dominate Toronto's heroin market, while prices dropped sharply within 2 years. By 1997, investigators describe him as the main figure overseeing drug transport from Southeast Asia into Canada. The record then shows us attention locking onto him through cases built around his partners, rather than through a direct public profile. In 1995, the FBI is described as learning his identity and role through indictments of New York-based partners, including Paul Kwok and Yongbin Gong, and coordination begins with the RCMP. The file says he had already relocated to mainland China at that time, a location that blocked U.S. pursuit through normal extradition channels. The opening arrives in 1998, when he travels to Hong Kong, and he is arrested there on August 12, 1998 by the Hong Kong police force, with FBI and RCMP involvement. He is extradited to the United States by the end of that year and denied bail. Investigators and prosecutors in the record describe his custody demeanor as calm, friendly, strategically tight-lipped, and outwardly respectable. Court records describe him avoiding trial and taking a plea to one count of conspiracy to transport heroin, with prosecutors viewing his cooperation as measured and controlled. At sentencing, the file says he expressed strong remorse and talked about opening a restaurant after release while focusing on family obligations. He received a 9-year prison term, later serving time at the Federal Correctional Institution, Elkton, in Ohio. The record says he served about 6 years before being deported to Canada in 2006 to complete 3 years of supervised release, while a defendant in the same broader case structure received a much longer sentence. In 2002, he requested a waiver of legal fees, claiming he had only $1,500 and was nearly penniless, and the request was denied after prosecutors argued he likely had hidden assets. The same file notes that across the full custody span, he served close to 9 years when tallying the total time in prison and detention periods tied to the case. Inside Elkton, the record places him alongside Lee Chung-chak, a Hong Kong-linked trafficker with dual Chinese-British nationality, who later becomes central to the next phase of the story. Lee is described as having been arrested in 1994 at the Canada-United States border on the same type of charge, then released in 2006. After supervised release ends in 2010, TSE shifts toward a new market and a new geography, and the file places him relocating to Hong Kong in 2011 with his family. That same year, the record says he founded Sam Gore, and business registration records are described as showing a Hong Kong shell corporation, created by Lee and his wife, using a residential address. Lee is later described as being extradited to Australia in 2022, after an arrest in Thailand tied to the Sam Gore operation. Investigators described Say's post-Canada strategy as a pivot away from heroin and into synthetic drugs across the Asia-Pacific region. The record frames this as a market turn paired with a distribution turn, with his older North American mafia-linked distribution system no longer functioning the way it once had. The file credits him with building an early guaranteed delivery model, where seized shipments would be replaced at no cost to buyers, a policy that reduced buyer risk and expanded trust among partner groups. Law enforcement accounts in the file also describe him as skilled at patching relationships among rival triads, including bringing 14K, Wo Xing Wo, and Sun Yi On into the same supply spine. Those triads, along with Big Circle Boys and Taiwan's Bamboo Union, are described as forming the backbone of Sam Gore's operation. The record also lists international partners recruited into the distribution web, including Japan's Yakuza, groups like Satudara and the Comanchero Motorcycle Club, and criminal networks described as Lebanese and Australia-based families. By the late 2010s, investigators and international agencies describe Sam Gore as a dominant force in Asia-Pacific synthetic drug distribution. Sources attributes to Say Chi-Lop an estimated control of over 70% of the Australian meth supply alongside strong positioning in Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. It also cites estimates placing Sam Gore's peak share across the region at 40% to 70% of an Asia-Pacific drug market valued around $90 billion. UN Drug Office figures in the record describe the Asia-Pacific market growing several-fold from 2014 to 2019. With Australia and New Zealand highlighted as a major driver during that window. The file also notes that meth proliferation pushed prices down steeply in some markets, with drops cited up to around 70% in certain places. This section stays focused on scale, share, and market movement rather than on street-level storytelling. Wealth is described in the record as immense, even when precise totals stay unconfirmed. UN estimates cited in the file place Sam Gore's meth revenue at roughly $8 billion to $17.7 billion in a single year in the late 2010s, alongside statements that the syndicate had expanded several-fold over a short run. Officials quoted in the record compare the potential scale of his wealth to the highest-profile cartel figures in world history. The file also links him to a money laundering system routed through Australia-based Crown casinos, tied to a national inquiry in 2019. Separate courtroom and reporting references in the file describe him living openly wealthy in Hong Kong, traveling by private plane, throwing large private parties, and hiring 8 Thai kickboxing bodyguards. It also includes his gambling profile, including a claim of losing 60 million euros in one night and a 2017 lawsuit in Hong Kong tied to $1.9 million in gambling debts, alleged by Marina Bay Sands. Investigators record the modern crackdown phase beginning with wiretaps rather than a single public bust. In 2012, the Australian Federal Police identify a Hong Kong-based figure called Sam Gore through intercepts tied to a Melbourne area drug distributor named Suki Liu. In 2013, AFP surveillance ties Sam Gore to say Chi Lop, and Hong Kong police are described as capturing images of meetings that help confirm identity for Australian investigators. A second major intelligence break arrives in 2016, when a mid-level Bamboo Union member named Kai Young-zae is arrested at Yangon International Airport carrying ketamine. Burmese authorities seize his phone and find detailed documentation tied to Sam Gore operations. And the file says the material is shared with the AFP, who identify Say through images found there. The record credits that multinational sharing with dismantling parts of the Myanmar-based production and logistics layers and disrupting sea-based smuggling routes into Australia. It also points to Australia's largest meth seizure in 2017, described as 1.2 tons seized at Geraldton in Western Australia. Public exposure hits in October 2019, with an in-depth report naming, say, Chi Lop and framing the syndicate's scale, and the file says police notices and international alerts followed. The record says authorities later learned he obtained a copy of an internal alert before the report broke, a detail that matters in how he moved afterward. After that exposure, the file describes associates distancing themselves while he continued traveling through the Greater China area and Southeast Asia. Reporting cited in the record places him in Taipei for an extended stretch, with law enforcement concern noted about his relationships and the difficulty of arrest or extradition while he remained there. In early 2020, he enters Taiwan and extends his status under special pandemic-era measures, and Taiwan's National Police Agency obtains a court order for surveillance. Taiwanese reporting, referenced in the file, describes a quiet life in an upscale area with hired protection, while interviews with the Ministry of Justice Investigation Bureau later conclude there was no basis for arrest under local conditions. The record then traces the final travel sequence that led to his capture. In January 2021, Taiwan deports him after denying further extension, and the file says officials notified Dutch and Australian counterparts of his intended route back to Canada via Amsterdam. A defense claim later appears in the record arguing flight routing was arranged in a way that increased extradition risk, and that claim becomes part of later courtroom dispute. On January 22, 2021, Dutch police arrest him at Amsterdam Airport Schiphol during a layover. The operation is described as Operation Kongur, led by the AFP with Dutch and Taiwanese cooperation and support from roughly 20 agencies across Canada, China, Japan, Myanmar, Thailand, and the United States, including the DEA. A UN official quoted in the record says his arrest would not shut the system down on its own, noting that replacement figures and existing conditions still allow the network to function. From there, the file turns into an extradition timeline with firm dates. In July 2021, a Dutch court approves an extradition order to Australia and Say is extradited in December of 2022, then arraigned in Melbourne within hours. He faces conspiracy to traffic charges tied to a time window from March 2012 to March 2013, linked to Suki Liu and other defendants, and he does not seek bail. The record notes the case still pending as of August of 2024. The file then adds a later outcome. In December of 2025, he enters a plea deal and receives a 16-year sentence with a 10-year non-parole period, with almost 5 years of custody time credited. Eligibility for parole is listed as January 2031. And the record says an extradition agreement capped the maximum penalty below what would normally be available, with further reduction tied to the guilty plea.